When beginning to learn 3D art, it can be difficult to understand how we go from texturing props to texturing huge assets such as buildings and boulders. Eventually, we can no longer continue to increase the texture resolution, but we still need to maintain a sharp detail and interesting material across our assets. So how can we do all of this? In this tutorial, I aim to answer just that by introducing you at a high level to many techniques we use in game development to solve these very issues. The methods we'll be going over can be applied in a variety of engines, and by the end of this video you'll have a better idea of which approach to use for which type of asset. We'll start with the absolute basics, covering how we can get a good resolution on large meshes through understanding something called texel density. We'll explore UV manipulation, in-engine tiling, kits, and more to accomplish getting this right. From there, we'll start to layer on ways to improve the look of our materials by using additional normals and some easy ways to inject some flexible visual interest. Moving on, we'll get into how we can blend multiple materials together in a natural way, simulating the layers we'd have in something like Substance Painter, all while maintaining our crisp texture resolution. Next, we'll explore decals and how they can add very specific details and breakup to our assets, punching up the visual quality one step further. Finally, we'll go over 3 master materials I created that combine many of the techniques we went through over the tutorial, each of which specializing in their own approach for texturing large assets. We'll be going through all of them one by one and explaining when it's most appropriate to use each and why. This is a tutorial I've wanted to make for quite some time now, since I find it's pretty difficult to find information on all these things, especially when you're starting out. So without any further ado everyone, let's go ahead and dive into the video. Alright, hello everyone and welcome to this new tutorial. So as you saw in the intro there, what we're going to be doing is talking about how we can texture large assets in games. We're going to be going over a ton of different methods and going over a bunch of different techniques from the very beginning and layering on more and more information until we end up here at the end with where we have our final shaders. And these are very, very flexible materials that we can use to cover huge surface areas, blending multiple materials and get a very similar look to how we would see stuff in maybe a unique texture for Substance Painter, but on very large assets, and the texture quality is going to be just as crisp as if we used a 4K or 8K texture or something like that, without really breaking the memory bank whatsoever. So like I said, we're going to be going through this step by step, and if you're watching this and you want to follow along directly in the scene, or you want to just grab these materials, I'm going to have a link down below to my Gumroad and my ArtStation where you can download this scene and just grab everything for yourself, use it in your scenes, or just like I said, to follow along and learn if you find that useful. But for now, we're going to start at the very beginning. We're going to start with engine tiling versus UV tiling. And for those of you who maybe aren't too familiar with how we go about this and what the issues are, this is going to be a bit of a high-level introduction to this, but I'm going to try my best to break this down. So when we're texturing assets, as you can see here, this and this both have the same material applied, but one is much bigger and one is much smaller. And that's going to be a bit of an issue because that means since this is scaled up, it's going to be blurrier than if we look at, say, this one, where it's going to be a bit more crisp. And one important term to know when we're talking about this stuff is texel density. And if you're not familiar with that, it's similar to how a TV monitor or a screen has pixels and a resolution. Each polygon or face in a 3D space has a certain amount of density that a texture is applied to it based on the scale of the UVs. If the UVs are bigger or smaller, or if the mesh is bigger or smaller in relation compared to the texture size that's applied, things are going to be blurry or crispy. So, for example, a common texel density in a modern game would be 1 meter squared equals 1K texture resolution. So we have a 4 meter cube by 4 meters and a 4K texture on this. And that's going to give us a nice crisp texture resolution. But if we scale this up to an 8 meter cube with a similar 4K texture applied, the polygons are much bigger, so the texture is not going to hold up as crisp because the pixels of that texture are being stretched bigger. So that's one way to sort of go about thinking about it. We want to have a nice, consistent, crispy density, and we're not able to do that for things that are so big, and that's why when we're texturing huge assets inside of Substance Painter or any other program, eventually we have to keep bumping up the texture resolution to match the density of something smaller like this. Now, if this is something you're not super familiar with, or if that didn't make total sense, I recommend checking out this older tutorial I made called Understanding UV Layouts. I go over a bunch of things like mirroring UVs, stacking UVs, multiple texture sets, but at the very beginning, one of the things that I do is go pretty in-depth on textile density, explaining exactly how it works. So if you want a little bit clearer of a breakdown of that, I recommend this. It's a totally free video to watch. There's going to be a download link in the description of this video to go check it out. And I'll have that, of course, linked in the description of the video you're watching right now. So yep, if you need an extra breakdown, you can go ahead and find it right there. But anyways, what does that leave us with here? So we're going to want to find a way for something that's big like this, where it's not able to get this density. We need to find a way to get this crispy 4K texture density onto an asset like this where it's not really possible. So there's two ways we can go about this and two ways that we can think about it, both of which have their advantages, and we're going to be exploring both of those the more we go into this tutorial. The first of which is going to be with just the UVs here. So if I go ahead and open up this cube here, this is just a standard 4 meter by 4 meter cube. I brought this in from Blender, and if we go ahead and look at the UVs, this square represents the UV space, and as you can see, the faces of the cube are filling up the space completely. So that means this entire 4K texture is being projected onto each of these faces completely and perfectly covering it, and we're getting a perfect textile density. It's very crisp, nothing's wasted, it's looking really nice. And the same thing's going on here with this cube, but since it's so much bigger, it's twice as big, we're getting, not as much resolution. So one way around that, and the easiest way to think about it, is let's just increase the space of the UVs. So if we go ahead and dive into Blender, we have this 8 meter cube here that I've been working with, and let's look at the UVs. Yep, it's just filling up that square perfectly. If we were to double the size of these faces, we would be getting double the resolution, and we'd be matching the previous cube. So that's going to work really nicely. Let's go ahead and give that a test. I'm going to hit R so I can enter my scale mode, and then just 2 to double it, make sure it's perfectly doubled, and there we go. And you'll notice here that we're actually outside of the 0 to 1 texture space. I know when a lot of people are starting, it's like sacrilegious to break out of the 0 to 1 UV space, but this is something you're going to have to get more comfortable with. For something like this, I'm mostly just worried about that it's tiling more, right? I'm not worried about baking anything for something like this, and since I'm not worried about baking, it doesn't really matter if I go outside of this space, because that's pretty much all that's really useful for is baking or getting very specific mapping to something that's a 2K or a 4K or whatever. But if I'm just worried about tiling and nothing else, I can break outside of this boundary, double my space, and now as long as my texture is tiling properly, I'm going to get double the resolution. So I'm going to go ahead and export this back to Unreal Engine, and we can go ahead and take a look at how that's going to change things. All right, let's go ahead and hit re-import here. With nothing but the UVs changed, and as you can see, now we have twice the resolution. Since our texture is a tiling texture in all directions, even though we're outside that UV space, we're getting pretty much perfect results here. We're just getting twice the resolution. Even though this is much bigger than the ideal size for our textile density, we're still hitting those textile density goals right here just by scaling things up on our UVs. And this is looking pretty good. That's definitely one way to go about doing things. Now, we have another way to accomplish this. And in order to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and move this over. And let's grab a cube where we didn't adjust the UVs, such as this one. And I'm going to scale it up by 2 just to make sure we're getting that bad textile density that we had before. So how can we do this in a different way? And one of the easiest ways to do this, and one of the most common ways you'll find across a lot of shaders and game engines, is going to be to tile directly in the engine. So I have this other shader set up here. If I go ahead and open this, it's pretty much the exact same as the other one, where it's just basic inputs for our maps, but we also have something called tile amount. And let's just go ahead and look at our parent material and see what's going on here. We have a texture coordinate and a tile amount multiplying into the UVs of each. And that's it. That's the entire setup here. And as we change this value from 1 to something higher or lower, it's going to adjust how much these are tiling. Let's go ahead and take a look in the material instance. I'm just going to apply this to the larger cube. And you can see if we scroll this, it's going to tile more or less, depending on the number we set. So 1 by default is going to be just the standard amount of tiling. But as we determined before, this is 8 meters. We want it to be twice as big. So we can tile this by 2 directly in the engine. And we're going to get the same texture resolution that we wanted originally. So UVs being twice as big, tiling by 2 in engine is going to be the same as if we just had perfect UVs on a 4K texture of something only half the size. So this is something to really consider. There's a bunch of different ways we can scale things in our UVs and in the material editor to sort of get things more crispy and sort of lay out that foundational layer. So that's one way to avoid having to do everything in Painter, having to worry about getting crispy texture resolutions on something so huge. We can just do it right in the UVs, do it right in the engine, and that's going to take care of that. Now, you might be thinking right now that this is looking pretty boring. What if we want to start adding more things on top of that? Don't worry, we're going to get there. But this is just sort of the very first fundamental section before we move on even further. So we have some interesting stuff coming up next and some other ways to cover a huge surface area. So let's go ahead and move on to the second section, which is going to be kits. So now that we can see the power of tiling textures and how they can cover large objects with good resolution, let's start thinking about how we can actually apply this information to the actual models we're going to be using in our game art. So one idea I want everyone to start thinking about really early on is the idea that we can actually model to the existing tiling textures that we have at our disposal. So normally we're told that we should make a model, unwrap its UVs, and then start texturing. But just as many, if not most, assets in games actually start with a tiling texture and then the model is made to fit that tiling texture. So the most basic example of what I can show to explain this is kits. So much like the cubes that we saw at the start, when these are lined up, we can see that things continue to tile. So if I take this UV cube here, make sure we have our snapping on, and I sort of duplicate it over, it's going to continue tiling. And that's because the edges of the UVs are lined up in a specific way that it's filling up the full space, and this edge ends where this edge continues. And we can take a look at that in Blender to see exactly how that's working. So we have this wall face, which will be showing an engine in just a second. But if we actually click on it, we can see that this edge here represents this edge here, and this edge represents this edge, and it's filling the texture space completely. So as soon as we start moving outside of this space, things just continue and they repeat over and over and over again. So if we line up our UVs in a way where the ends are going to meet and they're on a grid, and we start to duplicate things around, they're just going to continue over and over and over if we start snapping things directly beside one another. And as you saw in Engine, we had a very basic example of this setup, a very crude looking house, but you can see we have a full space here with good texture resolution that's larger than the cubes that we sort of went over earlier. And rather than bringing this in as one piece and just scaling up the UVs very large, I've broken things up into smaller pieces that all sort of slot into one another, and they continue the tile working perfectly. So this is really good because it's going to give us the texture resolution we want, but it's also very flexible because we can reuse these pieces to make a much larger house, a much smaller house. We can change the shape of everything. And as long as the UVs are lining up in a way where the end starts somewhere where the next one begins, and we want those pieces to click together, things are going to work out very good. So that's one way to think about how we can start making models to our existing textures. And just to sort of take a more advanced look at things, I found a kit here by a ArtStation user that goes by Alex Perez. Make sure to go check them out. They had some pretty cool stuff, but this is just a really great example of a more developed, advanced kit here. So we only have a few pieces, and none of the shapes are too crazy, but the end results are really awesome. So rather than making one solid chunk here and scaling the UVs up and making sure that they're to the right texel density, they've made a few pieces here worrying that these are all a crispy resolution and that the ends here sort of connect together in a natural way. And you can also, in some cases, just sort of cover the ends if it's a natural thing that you can get away with. So these, for example, are going to line up perfectly in the UVs when they're next to each other, but maybe sometimes you just want to cover an edge with a pillar or something like that if the texture seam is going to be causing some issues. But if the UVs are set up properly, you're not going to have to worry about anything like that. But just using these pieces here, they can make a gigantic building. We could make this 100 stories tall. We can make it more narrow, wider, whatever we want, just by thinking about how we have this tiling texture, and we're going to model our pieces to it to make sure the UVs are aligned in a way where we can snap things beside each other and continue the tile. You can see that this isn't quite a square shape, so that's going to have some interesting ramifications, but it seems like it's tiling much more vertically than it is horizontally. So you can sort of adjust things as long as it's lined up with a part of the UVs that's going to tile into the next piece. That's totally fine. So this is one way to approach this kind of thinking. And there's other ways to start thinking about this as well. So you can already see with this is a very, very basic version of it, but we can model to the existing textures after we've applied them onto things. So I've just sort of popped out a few shingles here. I've made a few sort of covers for where there are more obvious seams, same on the corner here. So these are pretty basic examples of what we can do here, but let's go ahead and take a look at that inside of Blender once again and just see how easy it is to set this up. So I have this roof piece, and I just sort of made sure that it's tiling into the next part. So it's 4 meters to match with our 4K textile density that I was going for from the beginning. And then I just wanted a bit more depth. So I literally just went in here and cut these out and extruded them a little bit. And there you go. We have some actual proper depth to this. So that's like the most beginner friendly way to start thinking about this. It's not going to mess up the UVs, because if we look at the bulk of this, the edges here are still lined up. And then I'm not too concerned about anything else here because it's not being shown. Let's get rid of that as well. And you can just see that the edges here are lined up, and everything in the middle doesn't really matter too much. I'm just trying to keep it as straight as possible. And then I just popped these guys out. So what does like an actual good version of this look like? Because I'm not going to hide it. This is a pretty quick bare bones example, but I just wanted to make it really simple and really easy to digest. So let's go and look on this PureRef at some more advanced versions of this. So this is something I worked on when working on gears, and this is something called a trim sheet. So this is a tiling texture that's tiling multiple different patterns or use cases in just one direction. So if we were to scale this way up, it's going to be repeating this over and over, which isn't too useful, but we have so much going on here. We can lay out our polygons on top of this and get some really interesting results, because these are all tiling in their own right horizontally. So I created this series of patterns and put it onto one material, and you can see how many use cases we get out of something like this. So these decorative shapes are used for these floor trims. These entire pieces are textured with just this material. So I started with this, and you can see I made out a specific part for sort of the encasing. I made out a specific part for the dividers, for the edge parts here, and then just sort of had some more ornate space for the different patterns that I was going to slot in. And you can see they're sort of used all over the place with the different patterns slotted into the main area. But we had, several variations of these to work together as a kit. So, dozens of parts, all just using the one material. And I just started with this and modeled all of those pieces to this sheet. Now I made this sheet with the intention of using it in a bunch of different ways, so I tried to make it very flexible. But you can see with just starting with a material, we can make assets to that, and the texture resolution is going to be nice and crispy because we can just sort of layer our UVs as much as we need to. We can tile them from left to right or scale them up if it's a full tiling texture as much as we need to. And it's going to save us a lot of time as well. So that's one way to start thinking about how we can do that. And this is a huge asset, and you can see that I am utilizing these sort of tiling trims all the way around over and over and over again. And there's no way something like this could ever be made with just a standard 4K texture, because you can see this as a 4K texture, how much space this is taking up here. And you can see it being wrapped around here several times. So I'm just thinking, I want to get this to be the right size, and then I'm just going to tile it over and over again, rather than try and cram everything into like an 8K texture, which is going to be way too expensive. I just made one thing. We have so many use cases out of it, and we just have to make sure we're controlling our UVs and laying it out very evenly and nicely. Now, I can understand when you're learning that this might be a little hard to wrap your head around, no UV pun intended. So I actually have an older YouTube video that goes a lot more in depth into this, and I definitely recommend giving this a watch if you're not entirely sure about trim sheets and tiling textures and how we can model something specifically to an existing texture. So for this, I'm going to actually open up the other Unreal scene I have here, and this is going to be pushing my 2080 to its limit right now, so if this video starts to lag, apologies. But I made this entire floor here, and this is just one mesh, and essentially the way this was made was by using this tiling trim here. So this main white part here is the bulk of the floor, and then we sort of have this darker area which I used to divide the pieces up. And I essentially just took this huge space and I cut things based on the patterns I wanted. I first laid things out to be the correct textile density, cut them up. As you can see, I'm laying out this big strip here on just this colored part of the pattern and cutting things up here and adjusting the tile to make sure there's none of the dark areas filling up the larger portions. So we can model to this one texture and fill up this huge space. And then to add more detail, I'm like, let's pop out some of these tiles and then we can, model more specific ones and put them in there. So in the middle, after laying everything out with the pattern I wanted to, I cut out some of those bricks and I added some individual shingles or tiles or whatever you want to call them and slotted them in there to give it a more dynamic look, so it doesn't just seem like it's one texture all the way through. And as I mentioned, this is a existing YouTube tutorial. This is, on this channel completely for free if you want to check it out. And you can find it here called Creating Detailed Floors for Games Using Trim Sheets. So that's a much longer tutorial specifically diving into that topic. If this is something you're more interested in, I definitely recommend checking that out. But it's really important early on for me to drill in the idea of we can actually model to existing textures. I feel like this isn't something that's explained super well. People just want to make everything unique. Things are going to look probably better that way for sure, but the bulk of things are going to be made this way, and it's also pretty much the only way we can get things to look very specific at a very large size. So that's how I went about this. That said, there's another way that we can get good texture resolution on very large objects. So let's go back to our main scene. No need to save this, and take a look at something else called world align textures. So here's a collection of rocks. They look very, very basic, but that's just going to be layer one. We're going to be expanding on this a lot more later on. And what's going on here is we have a nice crispy resolution on this. It's looking, I guess, pretty good as far as textile density goes. But the really cool thing about this is if we maybe look at one of these areas, like keep your eye on maybe one of the warmer areas. If we move it, what's going on with these textures is they're being projected in world space. So the texture is always going to be exactly in the same spot regardless of the asset. It's just going to be slapped onto the asset in world space. So what that means is if we tile it to the way that we want it to be tiled, we can scale this up as much as we want, and the resolution is always going to be the exact same, which is super powerful. If I actually open up this material instance and take a look at what's going on here, we essentially just have the inputs for our textures. I'll move this to the side. We have our control on our tiling, how much we want this to tile the texture over and over again. And then we have something called the transition contrast. So what's going on here is the texture is being projected from a bunch of different angles, and we can just sort of control the contrast between where they're blending here. And if we take a look at how something like this is set up, it's actually really, really basic. We have our main texture inputs, and this is going to look more complicated than it is, but they're just being plugged into world align textures. So world align textures are going to project them from the world space that we just sort of discussed there. And the normal gets a special one because normal has to change its values based on angle, unlike the other maps do. And the only other thing that's going on here is just the additional controls for how much we want it to tile, the position, and the actual contrast. But it's basically just one additional node for the actual textures we're plugging in, and that's it. And that's going to give us the opportunity to then, duplicate these as many times as we want to, scale them up as much as we want to, as long as the tiling is in line with what we want. and we're never going to have to worry about textile density, which is great. We're getting a really good crispy texture projected across all of that. And the best part, and something that a lot of people are very excited about, is we don't actually have to use any UVs whatsoever if we're doing this approach. Now, that said, as powerful as this is, it's really something that lends itself great to organic objects like rocks or boulders or something to do with snow, anything like that. But as soon as we're trying to get very specific shapes, we can't do that since we don't really have control. It's just being projected from a world space position. So if you want something organic, definitely go down that route. If you want something very specific where you're carving out very unique designs to fill a floor, or you want to make several pieces only using one texture and you want to be very specific with how that looks, you're going to want to use it this way where you're modeling to an existing texture. And pretty much anything like a kit or something like that, I'd always recommend having more control over how the UVs slide up next to one another. And then if you want something organic where you just want it to be very natural, you're not worried about how things are interacting with one another, World Align is super powerful. And even though these are multiple rocks jammed into one another, you can't really see where they're touching each other or connecting to one another because the world space does a great job of projecting evenly across everything. So those are two ways to start practically thinking about how we can use that information about tiling in Engine and setting up our UVs to get a good textile density across very large objects. Now, you might be noticing these aren't looking too good. Moving on throughout the rest of this video, we're going to start talking about how we can actually take that information and add some detail on things to make them start looking more interesting and like art you're actually going to want to show off. So let's go ahead and move on to the next part of this tutorial. All right, so as promised, we're going to start talking about how we can actually make things look a little bit more interesting and a little less generic. So the next topic is going to be macro and detail normals. So if we take a look at this rock here, it's going to be the same rock as before, but even just looking at them from a distance, we can tell this already has a little bit more going on. This is very smooth. It doesn't really lack any specific detail. We're seeing a lot of repetition across the surface. But here things are starting to feel a little bit more intentional. They're not fully there yet, but it's a bit more interesting. The shapes are carved out a little bit sharper. So what's going on here is we have the exact same setup as before, where if we start moving things around, the textures are going to remain the same in world space, which is super useful. We've already gone over all the benefits of that. But if we actually open up the material instance, we're going to start to see there's a little bit more going on under the hood here. So we have everything that we had before, but we also have something called a detail normal and something called a macro normal. So what I'm going to do here is first bring this up. So this is the actual rock that I grabbed off of Megascans to sort of put into the viewport here. And you can see it's using a completely different texture. It has a totally different vibe going on. It's not quite the same, but I was trying to make this look, as good as I could with a different generic tiling material on it. But one of the ways that I could do that is if I went into the material, I could grab the specific baked normal that was on this rock and think if I could, inject it into this somehow to get some more specific details, because without it, things aren't looking as sharp as they could. So the way that we're doing that is we have something called a macro normal. The macro normal is going to be the mesh specific normal that we can overlay on top of the existing textures to get that more defined, sharp look, get those details we want in there. And we can do a lot with that. So if I turn this to 0, this is just kind of how it was before with no specific details whatsoever, very smooth. And this is going to be the specific baked information that came with the asset from Megascans. I'm just going to turn that down a smidge. And this is great. And you might be thinking, if we're baking textures and this is specific to a certain size, isn't it going to break our textile density? And typically that's not something we really have to worry about all that much when it comes to very large assets like this. We're usually pretty okay with just putting on a macro normal for something that typically would break the textile density just because it's mostly there to affect the lighting information and making sure things are blending properly. And the actual tiling texture underneath is going to be what we're going to be seeing that's really pumping up the detail. So if I scale this way up, it doesn't really matter to us that the crevices here are not exactly to the right textile density. because what's underneath of it is, and that's what we're really looking at, and that's what's taking up most of our view. Now, on the other hand, we have something called a detail normal, and how this works is if we do scale something like this way up and we're finding that we're not quite getting the detail we want to, we can overlay something called a detail normal, which is going to be a very tightly tiled normal over top of everything that's going to take care of the look of something when we're really up close to it. So we have this detail normal here. If I turn this to 0, you can see we start to sort of miss some information. And if I turn it up a little bit, let me just crank it up like a ton to 10 or something. You can see it's overlaying another detail. And let's turn up the tiling to something like 15. We'll get a bit more on there. And then bring it down to something a bit more reasonable. You can see we have this normal information that's holding up really good when we're up close, because we can make this the textile density we want to, that's holding up right in front of us. So between this detail normal that's working right in front of us and the macro normal, which is holding up the overall sort of lighting and rendering information we want, even when things are scaled up, we can get more or less the exact look we're going for, regardless of the size of our asset. So we have the normal, that's a part of the actual material that's tiling in world space, the macro normal, which is specific to the asset, and it's going to be giving us these nice large shapes that are working really well, and then the detail normal, which we can tile a bunch of times, and it's going to make sure that when we're really close to the asset, we're getting some nice little bits of information as well. And if we look at this and how it's been building up since our previous material, it might come across as if there's a lot going on, but it is still pretty basic. We have everything we had before, but if we look at our normal, all we have is a blend angle corrected normal, which is blending in our macro normal into that. And all that's going on here is I just sort of have some control over how intense I want that to be, because we have a scalar parameter and a flat normal. But more or less, we have our original normal being blended into our new macro normal. And then once again, we're doing the exact same thing, but we're blending that through a detail normal. The extra nodes here are giving us the control to tile this as much as we want to. Meanwhile, with the macro normal, since it's specific to the UVs that we have, I just didn't bother setting that up. So just blending some additional normals on top of our original material, and we're getting some more specific shapes to the actual asset we have here. And the great thing is we can make infinite amounts of this material instance, plug in specific macro normals to whatever we're working with, and we can have a bunch of different boulders, all with the same sort of base material that's working here, but all have their very specific shapes and grooves and all that kind of stuff to break things up and start to add some more personal detail to each of the assets. So that's the first layer, and how we can add some more interest into our materials for larger assets. We can scale this up as much as we want. Still going to be looking good. But moving forward, we can make things look even more interesting if we start to blend other materials into our base material. So let's go ahead and talk about how we can do something like that. So next up here, we have something pretty interesting. As you can see, there's some actual moss and a secondary material being blended in here on top of the rocks that we had before. And things are actually starting to look a little bit more final, a little bit more interesting. The really cool thing about this, though, and the thing that makes this so powerful, is if we grab this and I start to rotate it, you might notice something interesting going on here. And that is that the moss on top of this rock is always generating on where things are pointing up, no matter how I rotate it. So at the bottom here, there's no moss at the moment. If I rotate it, the moss is going to come in. So we call this a Z-up material because in Unreal, the Z-axis is pointing up, and this is set up so that the normal of the mesh that's pointing up is going to have another texture blended on top of it. So this is also really useful for snow. Maybe you want something to be wet only at a specific angle, and moss is another really big one. But it's just an example of how we can start blending additional materials on top of our initial layers. So before we had these interesting normals coming in, but it was kind of boring. And now it's starting to look a little bit more final. I just threw in some extra leaves and stuff to sort of make it feel a little bit more grounded, a little bit more like things are actually coming together. But let's take a look under the hood and see how this is all beginning to work. So if I open up the material instance here, even in the material instance, we can see that there's moss always on the top. Even if I change this to like a cube, the moss is going to be at the top because the normals of this that are pointing up is going to be what's receiving the blend. And though we're getting quite a bit going on here, we're just building upon what we started with. So we have our detail normals, we have our basic inputs, we have our tiling, but now we have some Z up additional inputs here. So first things first, we can change what's being blended on top here really quickly. If we don't like this moss, we want to change things up. We have the freedom to do that. But we also have some settings for the actual sort of moss look, the fuzzy power, the core darkness. These are things that are specific to getting a good looking moss, or some foliage types really benefit from this. But what we're really interested in is the Z up blending. So we can actually dive into here and we can adjust the blend normal. We can lower how much is being blended on. We can increase it so it's very mossy. It's going to be taking into account the normals that are actually underneath the moss layer. So it's going to be based on that. It's going to take into account our normal map. So super useful. We can change the opacity of things. Maybe we don't want it to be as opaque. We can change pretty much everything. The tile, we can change the tint of it. We really have full control over it. And it's just going to be a matter of two different sets of textures blending into each other based on which direction the mesh is facing. And it's going to be looking at which way is pointing up. So let's actually dive into the master material for this and see what's going on. So this is where things are going to start to look a little bit more complicated, but the point of this tutorial isn't to really break down all of these things super specifically. It's just mostly to introduce you to these ideas and make sure you're aware of the different options that we have here within game engines. So we basically have the normal setup that we had before, where we have some world space textures that are tiling, and those are being plugged into a material attributes, which is just going to be housing all of the maps that we plugged into it. And from there, that is going to be blended by this material function, which is going to be where we're inputting all of our moss. We're getting our information as to how it's tiling, stuff like that. We have our fuzzy shader in here. And then those two setups are going to be blended by this normal, which is incorporating our normal from our original texture. And that's going to be used to blend our material attributes. So all the textures from one, all the textures of the other, and it's going to be blended by that normal information we're feeding into it, plugging that into our final node here. So I know this is a very high level view and look at things, but my goal here is more to just introduce you to this, and there are plenty of great resources to learn how to set up a Z-Up shader inside of Unreal or Unity or whatever you're looking for. So great. So now we're starting to see that there are ways that we can take something like this that is in world space. It has some interesting normals, but not quite that interesting of a material. And we can actually start layering more and more on top of it. So things are looking good. Things are looking great as far as getting the correct textile density and having interesting shapes. And just to prove it, let's just go ahead and scale all these way up. And you can see we can have these gigantic boulders. If I jump in here, yeah, we have these gigantic boulders. They're holding a very crispy resolution, blending with multiple textures, having unique normals, and we can reuse them as much as we want over and over. So that's one way to start thinking about things, and one great way that we can accomplish stuff to get large assets covered with a very crispy textile density, especially organic stuff. This is definitely a way that I would recommend that. Now, next up is going to be a more controlled way to get multiple materials, even more than just something like this, up to 3, 4, however many you need, blended on top of the assets you're working for, and a great way to strengthen up the actual mesh kits that we were talking about earlier. So let's go check that out. All right, so next up we're going to talk about Vertex Painting. So this one's pretty exciting because it allows us to paint between several materials all within our game engine, and it's pretty similar to what we would be doing in a dedicated texture software. So once we've set up our textile density the way we want it to be, we can go into our paint mode and engine and start to blend between different layers. So there's a few ways to do that inside of Unreal Engine. We can either go up here to selection mode and change between our options. We're going to be going for mesh paint, or you can hit Shift 4, which is going to take us to that as well. And you can see the sort of shortcuts here across everything. To get back, we're just going to go back to selection or hit Shift 1. So what we can do here is we can go to paint, and this is going to allow us to paint the vertex color of our mesh. So what exactly does that mean? Pretty much each vertex on an object can hold color information like R, G, and B, and we can use that to mask between different textures within our main material. So you can see as I'm sort of hovering across this after I've clicked paint, we have these little dots all across our plane here, and these are all vertices on this mesh. It's been subdivided to have a bunch of extra points on it, and the more points that we have, the more precise we can make the masks. So if we only had the dots in the corner, we could only color these and it would just be a huge gradient from one point to the next. But the more dense that the vertices are across the model, the more points we have to color individually, and we can get more results because of so. So the way this is set up is I have it by default blending from just a plain black, and we can bring in a brick texture, and I have that associated with the red channel. So we can have a different set of textures associated with each of these channels. We can adjust the size of our brush, the strength, the fall off, in which color we're painting. By default, white and black is going to be painted in if we hold shift. So I can paint, as you can see, by clicking. I'm holding shift here just because of the way I have mine set up. And we're starting to bring in this color as if we're painting it on in something like Substance Painter or Photoshop or whatever. And you can see wherever these vertices are, it's kind of having a jaggedy edge because we're just blending in a white value on top of certain things, and it's blending accordingly. So we can turn the size up, maybe try and make it a bit more subtle, but it's cool. This is like a very basic example. It's giving us the option to paint in another material, paint it out, do whatever we want. And like I said, we can have more options as well if we change between colors. But right now we just have it set up to be one texture blending in via red. So let's go ahead and actually take a look at how that's set up. And this is the most basic example, just to get the idea of what vertex painting is. We have that brick color being lerped with just the color black, and the information that's driving it is the vertex color. So it's pretty much saying wherever there's a red vertex color, we want to switch between these textures. That's it. We'd obviously push this a lot further for something a bit more complex, but just to get a very basic idea of how it's set up, this is how it is. We would obviously want to have corresponding maps for things like roughness, metallic, normal, all that stuff. But just to sort of see how it's put together in its most basic form, I thought this was pretty important. So going back to our selection mode, let's go ahead and actually take a look at a more advanced setup here. So here I have a sort of tiling floor brick, and you can see some other things blending into it, and it's looking a lot more natural. Now this is actually the exact same plane, subdivided the exact same amount of times, but we can use a few tools to push vertex painting even more. And one of the most common ones is by using height information. So a height map is going to say where things are sort of pushed out and how much depth there is to something. So these areas that are sort of recessed in a little bit further and deeper down are going to be a lower value in the height map, and things that are closer towards us are going to be lighter. And we can use that to blend things in using our vertex paint. So if I go back to that paint mode and we try it again on this asset, I'm going to turn the size down, maybe lower the intensity a bit. You'll see as I'm painting this in, it's going to opt to fill in the cracks before anything else. So I'm just going to start painting, and it's filling in the cracks of these areas before it spills over eventually onto our actual main bricks, which is super, super useful, especially for something like this where we want like dirt spilling into some sort of floor tile. And then we also have the option, as I mentioned before, to have multiple different types of textures. So I also included like a moss. So we can blend different types of textures, and we can control the way that they're interacting with our base material. And we also have the option to adjust the edges. So before you noticed, it was very like a very obvious gradient when things were blending out, but this seems like a very natural scatter. So let's actually go ahead and look at our material instance and see a little bit more of what's going on here. So this is starting to be quite the layer of inputs here, but it's pretty basic. I'm going to go through everything individually. So we have our base layer here. And this is once again using the ORD, which is the Quixel Megascans format of packing their maps. And this is our base layer here. And we have our main height. So the height that is coming out of this and plugged into our base layer is going to drive how this stuff is interacting with one another. Then I just sort of go through and I have the other things I want to be blending. So in this case, I have a dirt, I have a moss, and we have some control over these things to adjust how they're interacting with this base material. So I have some contrast on the actual height map that's going into this. So I can adjust, do I want it to be a lot more subtle and blending a bit more with a grunge? Do I really want to tighten things up? I think for now, we'll just go back to leaving it at 1. But then we also have something really useful, which is a sort of noise applied to the end. So normally where it would just be a gradient fading off into the end, I've set up a function here to actually make things have some noise as they're blending out. So I can tile this noise a little bit different. So instead of it just being a gradient, it's being filtered through this noise, which we can tile way up, make it feel like more of a natural dirt. And we can adjust the contrast on that as well to have a lot of control over the actual way this is blending without having to, you know, crank up to 1,000,000 vertices or something like that to get very precise control. So this is like the best of both worlds. We don't have to go overboard with the amount of vertices we add, and we can still get some cool results. So that's one really interesting way to start blending textures together. Like I said, we could blend even more if we wanted to. We have control over how each layer is blending individually and how it's interacting with the base layer. I'm just going to save that and close it. But there is a downside to going ahead and using Vertex Painting, and that is that at the moment with Nanite, it is currently not supported. So Nanite geometry in Unreal Engine 5 is super useful because it lets us more or less have unlimited geometry, which is, I guess I don't really need to explain the benefits of that. And the downside to that is since the LOD system with Nanite is constantly updating and constantly regenerating itself, it doesn't really work with Vertex Paint as of right now. The team at Epic has done some pretty incredible stuff making Nanite work with more and more of the art that we have in our engines. Like before, it never used to work with anything with opacity, but now it does. So maybe one day we can get Vertex Painting working with this. I imagine that's something that's on their radar. But at the moment, we can see if I change my view to Nanite triangles. Yeah, the one on the right here is built with Nanite while nothing else in this scene is. And if I go in here, go back to my paint option, maybe paint on some dirt. You can see there's a ton of vertices here. I can paint this on and have control over how that's working with things. But if I go to this asset and try and paint, it's just not going to let me. There's no way to really do it with this. So hopefully that's something they address in the future. But regardless, the benefits of using something like Vertex Paint is pretty much unlimited. You can see with the original kits that we were talking about before, how we can sort of paint on layers of paint and grout onto bricks. We can add wear and tear. We can add grunge. We can do whatever we want. And we have a ton of control over it, and we can adjust it from piece to piece, which is really, really great. So the only real downside to this is having to add a few extra vertices to our pieces. By the way, these ones are a little bit overkill. You probably don't have to do as many as this, and that we can't use it with Nanite, which admittedly is kind of a pain, but there's still a ton of amazing things we can do with it. And the principle behind this is actually how we texture landscapes. So if you have a huge area of ground on the bottom of a level, you're going to be painting things very similarly to what we just did here to blend between like a dirt and a grass and all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely very important to understand Vertex Paint and the amazing blending capabilities it has. So anyways, that's one way to blend things. In the next part, we're going to be talking about a different way that blends things, and it's going to be using masks, which is going to help us get around that issue we had with not being able to blend on Nanite. So let's go ahead and check that out. In this next section, we're going to go over how we can blend our textures using masks and a new system in Unreal called material layers. So here you can see we have a large chunk of rock with some pretty nice details, and it's maintaining its resolution regardless of its size. Now the cool thing about this is that the rock that you're seeing here is actually the exact same model as this scan rock right here. And the way that this is working is I've set up this rock to have its tiling working in world space, so we don't have to worry about the resolution. And then I've used this original normal as a macro normal for this, so we get some more detail and it's working with our lighting a lot nicer. And then I've layered on additional textures through a mask. So let's go ahead and take a look at this system. And just to confirm that things are going to be working properly, we can scale this way up and the resolution is still going to stay good. And we can just duplicate this, move it around as much as we want. And once again, it's a huge asset that we don't have to worry about the textile density. And I mean, we have been able to take it pretty far since this. So this obviously as a scan is looking fantastic on its own, but we've completely transformed it into a completely different type of rock. So let's go ahead and take a look at this in the material instance. And you can see that it's very empty looking. Even if we look at the details panel, there's nothing really going on here. And this new system actually, as you saw, lives over here in this sort of layer parameters tab. And this might start looking a little bit more familiar to something you would see in like Photoshop or Substance Painter. We have our different actual layers set up here, which is fantastic. And they're stacked on in a way, and we're blending them together. So how exactly is this working? Let's start from the bottom up. We have our background layer, which once again, we can just sort of slot things in how we want them to be. We can slot in different textures. And I also have a spot for a macro normal, a detail normal, the things that we talked about previously. We can adjust the tiling on this as well, which is great. And that's pretty much it for the base layer, which was more or less what we've talked about before, other things like tint and whatnot. But what makes it cool is once we get past the background layer, we have additional layers on top of it. So let's start by turning these off and taking a look at what each of them are doing one by one. So the surface wear, it's not doing a whole lot, but let's take a look at it a little bit more in depth. So if I open this up, we have a new slot in here. We can take a look at the textures that are being used and swap those out. We can adjust their tiling. We also have some options like affecting the color. So let's just sort of crank this up to get a better idea of what's going on here. And you can see I have set things up to add a splotchy pattern across this. So let's sort of keep this on at a lower value, maybe blend it in a little bit cooler, just something to break this up. I don't want it to be too intense, but just something that we can see that it's obviously having an effect. So how is this working? How is this actually being blended? So we have these layer assets here, and I should have exposed that here as well. Oh, that is what we went over. So we have these layer assets where we can adjust things like the texture parameters in the scalars. But then we also have something called the blend asset, which is going to control how this is actually interacting with the base layer. And you can already see here, we have something set to blue, and this is going to be associated with this. So by default, I have this plugged in. This is our blend mask. Let's get rid of alpha. And you can see there's just a whole lot of stuff going on here. So what is happening? So each of these different layers is a mask that's telling us to blend from one material to the next in a specific way. So I took this into Substance Painter. I just sort of added some information on how I wanted this to blend. So you can see this sort of splotchy color here is associated with the splotchy mask here. And then we have more of an edge wear, which is going to be associated with the green channel, which we're using for another layer, and some dirt for the red value there as well. So I have this plugged in, and that means that whatever I set up in my layer here, you know, changing the material, changing the tint and stuff like that, is going to then be layered onto our base layer wherever that blue mask is a value brighter than, you know, black. It's going to be fading in accordingly. So we have control to start layering things on like so. And since the actual textures that are being layered on have the correct textile density, the mask isn't really, you know, I'm not really too worried about it being a very crisp resolution, especially on something organic like this. I'm just mostly worried that it's going to be layering on properly. And even then we have things like contrast control to blur it out a little bit more, or do what we need to do to make some fine-tune adjustments. So that's just a very basic layer right there. If we bring back edge wear, this one was a little bit more important. You can see we're getting some highlight on these crispy edges, making this feel really sharp, really dry. In this case, I believe I'm just sort of layering on the same textures again, but you can bring on completely different materials. That's something that's totally fine. Once again, adjust the contrast, the tiling, anything you need. And for this one, I just cranked the value really high, which admittedly, I should probably find a better way to do these edges, but this seems to be working pretty good. And I can, adjust how intense this is however I want. Let's just put it back to about what it was at before. And if I go to the blend, you can see that this is blending with the same mask, where we're using the green value, which, as we saw earlier, was edge wear. And now let's go all the way to the top, which is dirt. And this is one where I actually am bringing in some new textures. I've brought in some dirt here, which we can, of course, swap in for whatever we want, and change the tiling on that until I found something that looked a little bit nicer, tinted it. And if we look at the blend, it's using the same mask. I adjusted the contrast to be a bit softer, and it's the red channel there. So this is really cool. It's very much just simulating if we were in Substance Painter or something of the sort. But how exactly do we set this up? Now, if I'm being totally honest, this being a new system, it's not something I am 100% confident diving deep into. We have to set up a bunch of different things. We have to set up systems for our blending. We have to set up each of these material layer instances on their own. So for that, I really recommend, and I will include this in the description, this fantastic tutorial here by Next Tut. He did a really great breakdown. It's pretty quick, pretty simple, and I think anyone can sort of go through this and they're going to be able to follow along with what's going on relatively easily. So really recommend this. I watched through it once. I understood how to recreate it on my end. And the other thing I'd recommend is, if you're not quite sure how to go about making the masks for this kind of stuff, I actually made a specific tool a while ago for this exact reason, and it's how to use Substance Painter to make RGB and A value masks within the program. So I'll just turn off the audio for this and play a little bit just so there's something in the background. But it gives us the option to view each of these channels independently, instead of having to go into Photoshop and sort of pack our channels that way. And there's definitely ways around it, but I just found this was a very easy way to do it. So if you're interested, I'll include that in the description as well. But basically, this is just to get an overview of this as an option. When Vertex Painting doesn't work because of things like nanite, we can still blend together multiple textures through masks, and Unreal Engine has some fantastic new tools to support just that. So really cool, fantastic way to do things. So between this and Vertex Painting, that's pretty much how the majority of things are blended for very large scale assets. So anyways, that's a cool look at the new material layers and using our UVs for masks. Let's dive into the next area, which is really interesting, and that's how we can pump up our quality to the next level using something called decals. So that brings us to our last section here, and arguably one of the most exciting, which is decals. Now there's two main types of decals. There's projection decals and mesh decals, and we're going to be going over both of those. But as you can see here, we're getting some really interesting variety of things we can do with said decals. So this is just a plain cube. This is just a simple plane, as well as this on the bottom. And we can get a lot of cool things going on here. So this plane here just has a tiling texture on it, but you can see we have this really intense detail of this large cut and this huge sort of concrete cave-in crash, as well as this debris all over the place. And if I hit G to go into more of my editor mode here, you can see that there's these little symbols across everything, and these are just decals, so we can move these around. They're textures that are being projected into this space here, and you can see when we're bringing in a decal, there's this sort of little volume with an arrow pointing in a direction, and wherever this volume is pointed and whatever is in it is going to get that decal applied to it. And there's a huge library of these in Megascans. You can go ahead and grab those. So sometimes they're cutting out, sometimes it's more like this, where it's debris that's chunking off. And you can see normally through something like Vertex Painting or blending with a mask, we wouldn't get something so specific like this. So that's where decals come in super handy. We also have types of decals that actually fake depth really nicely. If we go ahead and open up this material instance, which once again, this is from Megascans, we have something called POM, and this is going to be sort of a simulated depth that takes things like one step further than just a normal. So we turn this off and it's much flatter feeling, and we turn this on and there's an actual depth to it. So it's something to be aware of when you're setting up your decals. Really, really cool stuff. And with the projection, it's really great for something like putting a big complex logo or design or something very specific that needs to be scaled up, splattered across something that is already tiling. So there's a lot of really cool things we can do with that, and you can see we can really compress a ton of detail into this in ways that we wouldn't be able to do so without either making a unique piece with unique textures, or really breaking how much we can do with something like Vert Paint, for example. So this is a great option to localize some detail and project it on as a texture in a very modular way, because once again, we can move these, grab them, do whatever we want, rotate them, and reuse them all over the place. So it's used a lot for ground debris, damage, and large scale logos that you'd see on stuff such as so. Now, the other type of decal is a mesh decal. So while these are projected on using decal actors, a mesh decal is pretty much going back to what we talked about before, where we're modeling to a texture. So here I just have this concrete cube, and if I go ahead and find it, this is just underscore 2A, and this is 2B. So it's part of it, just as a separated mesh. You can combine them if you want to. I just thought I'd keep this separated to select it and see. And if I go ahead and grab this and we take a look at the texture, let's maybe make it a plane, you can see it's just an opaque texture where I have sort of like a damaged edge, some damaged splotches, and I've pretty much modeled to this and laid it on top and just tinted things so that they're similar, and we have chunks of damage going across our concrete cube. And if we look at it inside of Blender, once again, modeling to our textures, huge. So we're getting some really, really interesting edge damage and very specific targeted wear and tear with specific shapes that we want in the exact location we want. And all we have to do is pretty much duplicate our object, cut out the shapes, and then just push them out slightly so they're not directly on top of the surface. So we have no Z-fighting, and we can have a ton of control over where we're putting these shapes. And just to drive this home even further, going back to the example I shared before, you can see these sort of concrete chunks coming out. These are going to be modeled mesh decals that I used across all of this. So this is using several textures. There's the trim that we discussed earlier, but another one was a decal sheet to sort of get these chunky concrete pieces where I would, actually cut out the silhouette and then lay out these decals on top of it. So mesh decals are also very, very common for anything, hard surface and large scale. You'd probably see screws or bolts or vents or electrical sockets. If you want to start getting some ideas, you should go ahead and dive into the Megascans library, as well as the Substance Algorithmics library for this kind of stuff. Has a ton of decals, and you're going to start to get some ideas of the kind of details that you can use this for. But essentially, it gives us another opportunity to get some breakup on our tiling textures that we wouldn't really be able to do so with a specific mask or vert painting. Something that's just way too specific and way too targeted, we can get that done with decals. The main difference and why you'd want to use one over the other is this is going to be quite a bit cheaper. These tend to be pretty expensive. And typically, if you have these together on the model, you can move them around together, while these, it's a bit trickier to work with them, so they're a bit more expensive. And also, since they're based on projection, like so, if I then, what's a good way to explain this? Let's say I have this cube here, and this is like an object in the scene, and I have it in that volume. We're going to get some issues here. Now, we do have the option to go into every independent asset and turn off receive decals, but you can see when you have a scene with a ton of objects how complicated that can be. The other benefit of this is we can once again reuse our textures by cutting things up very specifically and modeling to our textures, while these typically are their own dedicated decal. But anyways, those are two different systems of decals and ways to start thinking about how to add a bit more specific detail to our assets. And with that, that covers all of the basics. These are pretty much not every use case of things we can do to texture large assets, but some of the most popular. And if you understand what's going on here, the gears should start turning as to how you can texture more or less anything within a large game environment. So with that said, next up, we have a few examples where I've combined several of these together. So let's go ahead and take a look at these and take a look at some final shaders where I would definitely, actually be using these in a proper game environment. So last up, let's go ahead and take a look at a few master materials that combine several of the things that we talked about up until this point. And these would all be things that I would be pretty happy to use in a actual environment I was working on. There's always ways to improve things further, but each of these in their own right have a ton of use cases for them. So let's start off with this first one. This, as listed here, is a 4-layer vert painting system with the edge masking we went over before, with full control over each of the texture maps that are plugged into it. So this is actually going to be 4 pieces. You can see we can vert paint across several of them. And I just went ahead and put on a decal here just to show that we can have that applied to something like an urban situation to get a big gigantic sort of logo or whatever we need to, a pop of detail across a system like this. So this is similar to how I would go about something like this. But let's actually go ahead into the painting for this, and you can see we have a bunch of different layers here, all of which we can blend in our own way. So I just sort of have a grout or something that's going over top of the base layer bricks. We then have the paint, and then in the final layer I wasn't quite sure what to do, so I just have a slightly darker and slightly shinier version of that same paint layer, just so that we get some variation across that since it's covering a bunch of space, and we can have some further adjustments to it. So looking at the material instance for it, you can see we have a ton of control and a ton of power with things. So the noise that we're using for this sort of edge here that we've already discussed, we have the first layer of textures. We can tint them, we can affect the roughness, the normal intensity, the tile of everything. Same goes for the other layers here. And basically just exposing everything that we can, including the roughness, which is affecting this top layer here. And you can see just by changing sort of the color and the values of the same texture, we're just getting a bit more breakup, and it's not going to be tiling as much. Considering that this is 8 meters by 8 meters, you really don't notice the repetition because of how much is going on here. So this is a really useful setup if you're trying to cover large walls, anything like that, and definitely something I would be happy to use as far as a vert paint system is set up. If we move over one more, we have the same thing going on, except for with this, we have the system set up to be in world space. So I can go ahead and move these around, and the textures are going to stay in place. So if you want to have some sort of vert paint system for something a bit more organic, or maybe you don't really want to worry about UVs on something like a building you're working for, and you want to break everything up with maybe large pillars or trims, this can be sort of bent to a variety of different situations. And if we go ahead and take a look at this, the situation is pretty much the same, minus the fact that it's in world space, but I also have an input for macro normals. So if we want to put this on a gigantic rock, for example, and start blending textures together, as well as we have the intensity of that to adjust, and everything else, all the layer controls, the adjustment of the noise that's being plugged in as well. So very similar to the first, but in world space, so we can use this on different types of assets and in a bit more of an organic way. And finally, the last thing I have set up, and this is going to be for when we don't have something that can use this kind of setup, so maybe something more in nanite. This is going to be pretty common. I have a material layer system, which we discussed before. That's in world space, so we can move this around however we want to. It is using a Z up texture, so we have this moss blending, so we can sort of change things up however we want, and a macro normal. So it's pretty much the layer system from before, but we also have the Z up, and we can take a look at this. We have all the Z up blends, the options to change our textures, our tints, our tiling, our opacity, all that kind of stuff. With the power of our layer system from before. And I even showed, if we want to get some very specific details, I wasn't quite sure what to use decals for in this case, but maybe some bird droppings or animal droppings or something like that. I just took some blood decals and cranked the the brightness all the way up. And you can go ahead and put that together like so. But anyways, there are a million different ways to texture large assets. This is really just scratching the surface, but the point of this video was to hopefully introduce you all to a bunch of different ways of thinking, how we can set up our UVs, how we can deal with in-engine tiling, how we can layer on different materials, how we can use decals, and the different way that all these systems can work together. So once again, if you're interested in this specific scene and you want to try and use some of these materials, I'll have a link to this in the description below. But hopefully this gets the gears turning a little bit on how you can approach your own scenes and different ways you can go about texturing the gigantic buildings or the huge boulders or whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. So yep, the goal here, I think, to introduce you has hopefully been successful. If you have any additional questions, let me know in the comments. If there's anything specific you want me to cover, hopefully I can point you in the right direction. But for now, I think that's going to cover it in this video. So thank you so much for checking this out. Once again, there's going to be links to everything we talked about in the description, so make sure to check that out. But once again, my name's been Dylan Abernathy, or Tie-Dye here on YouTube. Thank you so much for checking this out, and hopefully this could have been useful. So that should do it for now. Have a great day, everyone.